Hello, crafty friends! It's Alicia here with the project for Tailored Expressions. In today's video, I'm going to be using products from the new For Her release to create a couple of cute cards featuring vintage baking dishes with a little added shine. From the new release, I'll be using the What's Cookin' sentiment stamp with coordinating dies, the new Up Against the Wall 6x6 split background stamp, which just wait to see how handy that split comes in, and the Bake Me Happy die set with lots of fun vintage kitchen items. For cardstocks, I'm using Cookie Monster, sea salt, and sugar cube, and for inks, I'll be using Cookie Monster and sea salt. I also pulled out circle stacklets for a little additional die cutting, and for my stamping, I'll be using the TE exclusive Teal Misty, the Just Press tool, and I'll also be making use of the piece of acetate I always keep right in my Misty. I'll be using a variety of adhesives, which will be listed below, and for some extra shine on my baking dishes, I got out my bottle of Glossy Accents. Let's get crafty! I'm going to get started with the die cutting. For this, I got out scraps of Cookie Monster and Sugar Cube cardstock. For the plain baking dish, I'll be cutting one from Cookie Monster and one from Sugar Cube. The details on the baking dish will be from Cookie Monster. And finally, for the bowls, I'll be cutting the bowl itself out of Sugar Cube and the details out of the Cookie Monster. Once all of the pieces were die cut, I brought in my bottle of Barely Art liquid glue with that nice fine tip, and I adhered the layered pieces together. The liquid glue, not only does it dry clear in case something seeps through, but it gives me a little bit of wiggle time to get everything lined up nicely. The next step is going to be to add the glossy accents to give a little bit of shine and a more realistic look to the baking dishes. To hold down my die cut while I add the glossy accents, I brought in a little piece of the labeling tape, and now when I add the glossy accents, I like to kind of burp or make sure I get out any air bubbles on the tape, and then once I know that's out, I draw kind of a border around the entire die cut piece. Then I added a couple lines internally, and I tried to, with the nib, move it around to fill in the area. Now I didn't put down enough at the beginning, so every once in a while I do squeeze the bottle a little bit more to get out more of the glossy accents. You just don't want to go overboard here and make it too thick. Now you might have some bubbles. If they're little ones, I just leave them, but you'll see here that I do end up with a pretty big bubble. So I brought in a pokey tool and just burst that, and then I went back in and filled in any missing areas. Now what I like to do, I don't really know if it helps or not, is I like to kind of like tap the piece onto the surface to level out the glossy accents, and then when I'm all done, I can just carry it by that piece of tape over to an area where it won't get touched. I added the glossy accents to the two remaining die cuts in the same way, and then I set everything off to the side, and I did let these dry overnight. But luckily, through the magic of video, you won't have to hang around quite that long to see the results. Now it's time to see that new background stamp in action. The Up Against the Wall stamp is red rubber and it's split in half. Because of the 6x6 size, you can use a landscape or a portrait orientation for your cards. For the one I show you on screen, I will be doing portrait. I held my piece of sugar cube cardstock in place with a little bit of tape runner, and then I got the red rubber stamp set up on the cardstock. I placed each piece face down and made sure that they were butted right up against each other. Then when I pick it up with the door of the Misty, I have my stamp exactly where I need it to be, but now I can remove the wallpaper from the top so that I can stamp that in a completely different color. How cool is that? For the wainscoting at the bottom, I wanted to do kind of a white look, so I'm using that sea salt ink to ink up that portion and stamp it. Now because sometimes these inks dry back a little bit, I did end up inking it and stamping it twice. Once that was done, I didn't move anything. Instead, I brought back in the top half of the stamp and put that right up against the edge of the bottom half. Now I can remove the bottom and my wallpaper is exactly where it needs to be to stamp onto the top half. So I inked that up with the Cookie Monster ink, and here's a close-up look at that finished. How fun and easy. Off camera, I cut a sugar cube cardstock circle using the third from largest circle stacklet. And now, because I had a set of baking dishes already quote unquote in the oven, those are dry and ready to be used. Before bringing them back on camera, I did add some foam sticky strips to the back so we can have a little dimension on the card. I brought back in the circle I had die cut and I tacked that down temporarily onto the grid mat. Now I'm going to play with the stamp that I'm going to use on the front, which reads "We're Not Old," and the baking dishes to find out how everything will fit on the circle. Once the layout looks good, I brought back in some of that removable labeling tape and I tore a piece that was wide enough to fit across the bottom of my circle. What I want to do is create kind of a place for my baking dishes to sit, so I'll be doing a little ink blending. That piece of label tape is now going to do a little mask so it looks like a flat surface. For the shadow, I'm using the sea salt ink to give it just a little hint of color and match the wainscoting that I just stamped. Now I want to get the first half of the sentiment for today's card stamped at the bottom of that circle, and I'll be using Cookie Monster ink. I hold the circle in place with the magnet, and then I'm going to get my red rubber stamp set up on that. Now, because I only have one shot here and I want to make sure it's nice and straight, this is when I bring in that piece of acetate that I always keep with my MISTI. Now I can ink up the stamp to see how it looks, and actually it looked great that first time, so now all I have to do is remove the piece of acetate, ink up the stamp again, and then get it stamped onto the circle. For the inside of the card and the second half of the sentiment, I cut a piece of sugar cube cardstock to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. Now I'm going to get the stamp set up that reads "We're Vintage" onto the top third of this, trying to get it centered left to right. I did use the grid line on the MISTI to try to help with getting it straight, but I also used that same process as before with the clear acetate to make sure everything looked good. Now on this one, it did need to be adjusted a little bit, so I cleaned off the acetate with a wet rag, re-stamped it to test it, and then it looked great. So now all I had to do was remove the acetate, ink up the stamp, and stamp it onto that piece of cardstock. Now it's time to get the baking dishes added to my sentiment circle. Once again, I kind of played with the positioning to make sure everything would look okay, and then I pulled the release paper on the back of all of the sticky strips and started adhering those in place. With each piece I added, I tried to tuck it in a little bit behind the previous one to make the stack look a little more realistic. Do you collect vintage bakeware? If you do, let me know your favorite color below. I really like the color as shown on screen and also the peach versions. Now all of the pieces are ready, so let's get this card assembled. Off camera, I made a top fold sea salt card base and I added my wallpaper piece to the front center of this. Then I added my inside piece centered as well, and for the circle on the front, I decided to add a little extra dimension, so I put some foam tape strips on the back of this. When I went to put it onto my card, I did add some Barely Art liquid glue just so I would have a little bit of wiggle time because I wanted to make sure it was centered and I wanted my kind of shadow or my shaded area on the circle to match where the top of the wainscoting was on the background. So that's a good tip if you ever want a little bit more wiggle time if you need to adjust something. To finish the card off, I wanted to add a little more shine, so I brought in some clear drip drops to go with the glossiness of the baking dish. I added 5 of these to the front using Barely Art liquid glue and Embelly jelly. As a bonus surprise in this video, and because I had to make 2 sets of baking dishes, I did create a second card off camera using that background stamp with the horizontal version. Here are some close-up looks at both cards. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. If you enjoyed the process, a thumbs up is appreciated. And if you're not already a subscriber, we do hope you'll click on the button below so you're the first to know about our latest videos. To find out more about the products I used today, you can check out the links in the description box below or visit the Tailored Expressions online store at tailoredexpressions.com.